Hello and welcome. I'm so glad you could be with me tonight. I'm talking tonight with James Lenfestey, and I think many of you know who he is. He's been a popular journalist with the Star Tribune, writing on education and energy and environment. He's a poet, a very wonderfully known poet around our country. He's published several books, poetry books we'll talk about. He's also a very strong environmentalist and really got into being an environmentalist way back before most of us were scared. So I'm pleased you could join me to pick your brain and learn from you and have you share some of your poems too. So welcome, Jim.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here, Mary. It's a great joy. Thank you.
Well, you're welcome. Let's go back a little to your childhood for fun, because I think people are always curious, you know, how did he get to be the way he is, this wise man in the cities here?
I take that as a compliment. I'm not sure my family would agree, but wisdom comes with age. I certainly didn't have it to start, if I have it now. But I grew up in a little town of Deep Here, Wisconsin, near Green Bay, and one of the joys of being there was playing around the river that was in my backyard. And this goes to the environmental question. There was only one problem. We weren't allowed to touch it. It was an open sewer. The Fox River flows north from Lake Winnebago into Green Bay off the Niagara Escarpment. And they had 30 paper mills in 30 miles. Ooh. And it led to a lot of prosperity. My grandfather's family emigrated there to be part of the paper industry. But it was an open running sewer. But it was a great town to be from. But that's, I think, when I got a sense that there's something wrong here. And in fact, the air. My mother, there was a secret war that went on in my house that I didn't know anything about at the time. But my mother belonged to that communist organization, as my dad called it, the League of Women Voters.
He was very suspect.
Because he was selling coal. And the air, Green Bay was, with Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, were the two most air-polluted cities in the country, too. And the League did a study and found out that 90% of the trips to eye doctors were to take cinders out of people's eyes.
Really?
And when I read about that, when I was researching my old hometown, I realized, God, I remember going to the eye doctor and he'd pull these things out of my eyes. It's just a black rain coming down. Anyway, they've cleaned it all up. It's one of the great environmental success stories in our country. Took 50 years of intense activity, and it's actually a hopeful story as we deal with some of the other issues we're dealing with. Climate change, which we'll talk about, and which I've written about a lot.
So did that pique your interest in terms of doing more writing about climate and the environment when you were at the Tribune? Because
well, I would say no.
I was interested. A fluke? They assigned you that.
No. In fact, I created, when I was on the editorial board at the paper, but I created the energy beat. There was no such thing, but I was interested in it. The environment was, of course, a beat that I also assumed in the editorial page, but the energy was not. But energy processes always interested me and still do, and I give a lot of talks about it now, about the politics of energy and others as we deal with this need to transform our system. But it could go back to, you know, the fact that my father was in the energy business. I never thought of this for decades and decades, but he was selling coal. He was in the coal business.
Right.
One of the reasons he was mad at my mom for pointing out the air pollution, and but he was a great guy, and I had a very blessed childhood. But then I will say, you know, there was a wonderful, wonderful article yesterday that I want everybody to know about. It was the front page story of the New York Times Book Review on Sunday.
Okay.
Written by Jill Lepore, who is probably the greatest living historian. And it was about the Apollo program, which was, you know, the first man on the moon 50 years ago.
Right.
But she pointed out how, at the end of the day, we forgot something, which was this planet we left behind. And she made an amazing transition of what was actually, there are other things going on as we now we do revere our efforts to go to the moon. But now the Johnson Space Station is drowning, and the Kennedy Space Center is washing away. Literally, both of these are literally
they're right
true.
on the edges, we might call it.
And we've kind of mistakenly looked up when we should have been looking down. And she made a comment at the end, and this struck me because this was what really changed me. And it was the first picture of Earth from space. And I don't know if you remember that, Mary, or any of you when you first saw it, or any of your viewers. But for me, it was, I felt it like this. And she talks about how all the astronauts, every one of them from all the countries that have been up there now, they all feel fundamentally changed when they look and they
down.
see our Earth system with its rivers which look like bloodstreams, and it's almost a beating heart. And you know, that Gaia, sense of Gaia, it's a living being, and it is. And to look at that in the context of the utter blackness of space, for me it was a game changer. And that led to the Earth Day, and I founded an organization. I had begun to teach at UW River Falls, and I founded River Falls Ecology Action, and I've been active ever since.
This is back in 1970,
That was in
early 70s?
I started that in 1969, and then we did a lot of activities for the very first Earth Day in 1970, and I've been involved in Earth Day ever since in varying ways. And we've had many successes. And then the climate crisis came along, and that's a whole other thing.
And you use the word very carefully, the word crisis, don't you?
Yes.
Now, we're not using that word in the general media press coverage yet, I don't think very often.
You know, I have a book here that we can talk about, a book of poems, which are really grief, climate grief, and I wrote them sort of between 2008 and 2012. I've covered climate change and the problems that this relates to since 1988, which was when the first public hearings were held in Congress with Senator Tim Wirth and Al Gore telling us, the citizenry, the story of what science has known for 100 years and more, that carbon is the blanket for our atmosphere, and you add more carbon, you add another blanket or another blanket. And once I looked into the facts, it was alarming, and I was giving a talk a few weeks ago to a breakfast group, and the gentleman asked me at the end, "What's your biggest failure?" And I said, "Well, I got a lot of small ones, countless small ones, but the biggest is the failure of my profession, the profession of journalism, to recognize and to tell this story and to lead rather than follow, because there's a tremendously effective propaganda campaign against the facts of climate change and a tremendous interest to forestall us dealing with this."
Don't you sense, though, that just in the last, I'm going to say half a year, there has been kind of an uptick, a groundswell in a sense of people starting to get frightened in a way that's getting attention?
There's many wonderful things going on right now. You know, in the state of Minnesota, 29 states have passed very intense renewable resource standards to eliminate fossil fuels, 29 states. But you do the math, that means 21 have not.
Have not touched it yet, yes.
But it's from below, a great deal is happening. And then around the world, at some point, there's an amazing Swedish girl named Greta Thunderbird, and all of you should go online and look at her speeches. But she's changing the world.
She's, 13 years old,
yeah,
too,
she's 16 now, but she stands up and shames us, shames you and me and your viewers, saying, "What are you this is not something to talk about, even though we're talking about it. We must act," and she's so right. Big changes are coming, and the problem is there's the war, it's a war. I call this is World War IV. World War III, by the way,
title, yes.
was the war against indigenous people, and it's still going on around the world today. But World War IV is the war on the environment, and this is the great final battle. And there are some very powerful forces. You know, the fossil fuel industry is the richest industry the world's ever seen. All the people know. I mean, all the executives know. The Saudis know. But they look at their balance sheet and they say, that's where I'm going. And I mean, the Saudis have caused all kinds of trouble and behind the scenes and, you know, undermining conferences. And the Russians are the worst in the world right now, including our own elections. But so, in 2008, I wrote this. I mean, I'd left the newspaper in '98 and kind of saying, this is not enough. And also to be a different kind of writer. That
was one of my big questions, because that's a big switch from factual reporting and writing to inspired, emotional poetry writing.
Thank you. It is, and I'd always been interested in the latter, and it was really my best work. I've been writing poems as a boy since I was like 15 or 16, and they'd all end up in a drawer somewhere or on the floor. But I always did it, and then I began to publish a few along the way while I was doing all this other work. And but it really, when I left the newspaper, I had taken. I'll give you the line, my standard line now. Journalism is the relentless gathering of the facts of the outer world and arranging them into a story that the average reader can understand.
Right. Most important first, right?
Yep. But the key is the facts of the outer world. Poetry is the relentless gathering of the facts of the inner world and arranging them into a fact or into an arrangement that one hopes a reader can understand. And I care very much.
But with some mystery often, right?
Well, the difference is the word emotion means to, the Latin root is to come out of. And what does that mean? It means to come out of the body. Here's a story. When I left the Star Tribune after work, where I worked on the editorial page for 8 years, when I came home, my head was hot. I mean, I was churning.
Literally.
This was literally, it was working so hard. When I leave a day of creative writing, my hands are hot.
Interesting. And literally, too, you're talking.
Literally. Creative writing has nothing to do with this. It goes right this way. All art is tactile. All art comes from the body. It doesn't come from the head. The head gets in the way often. So if you really and you have to kind of unlock yourself and let it go. And writing goes pen or paper. I have a funny poem I don't have here called "Ode to My Papermate Flare," and also "Ode to My MacBook Air," which is really what I work on most of the time. But you know, all artists, you know, you're a sculptor, it's this. You know, you're a painter, it's this, and it comes through your body.
My daughter, emotion. The dancer that I
the dancer, of course, literally is the body.
Yeah.
And people often don't think of that for writing because it seems pretty abstract. It's not at all. So and so I felt strongly. I had taken journalism as far as I could go, up to the edge of the emotional life. I wrote one for Christmas morning, the famous day that nobody reads the paper. But I got a few calls saying I really touched people. But I bring it up because I deeply respect that it's a blood-brain barrier in journalism, and I deeply respect it. Journalism is not about emotion, it's about gathering the facts and telling the story. I wanted to cross that barrier, so I did. I didn't quite know how that was going to work and where it was going to go, but I left the newspaper in '98 and began a little bit of this. You know, I did a lot of different things. I've written plays, I've written screenplays, I've tried all kinds of things that work off that other side. The one that really got traction, well, my essays and then my poetry, which began to get traction in the late '90s and then on into, I have 6 books now and another one coming out.
I want to hold up some of your books, just so, because time is going fast. I want people to see, and then we'll have you read a little bit from several of these books. So first of all, I'm holding up all kinds of fun little markings here. Seeking the Cave. Just describe how you would describe this to someone sitting on an airplane next to you.
Yeah, okay, here's what happened, speaking of an airplane. Well, when I wrote the book, it was 30 years ago. I went to China in 2006, and the story is about 30 years before that, so it's now 40 years ago. I fell in love with the voice of a poet who lived in a cave 1,200 years ago in China. And I couldn't explain this to myself. He wrote stuff like, "Here we languish, a bunch of poor scholars ravaged by extremes of hunger and cold. Out of work, our only joy is poetry. Scribble, scribble, we wear out our brains. Who will read the works of such men and women? Mary, you can save your sighs. We could inscribe our poems on biscuits, and homeless dogs wouldn't deign to nibble.
Oh, so as you said, the humor, the insights.
You know, I recite that poem now all the time when I give talks. It's the most hopeful poem I know, because what is it for writers? Here are some guys 1,200 years ago sitting around with each other complaining, oh God, nobody's ever going to read my stuff. Are you kidding me? Why am I wasting my time? No one's ever going to read this. And here I am, 1,200 years later and 7,000 miles away, reciting it to you and your audience.
Getting all excited and loving
heart.
it. Yeah.
So the secret of art is you never know where it's going, and you just throw the darts out and let it go.
So
Journalism, you get in the paper every day.
Yes.
Poetry, you just throw, it's like little butterflies, and you just let them go, and they may land,
See
they
where
may
it
never.
settles. Yeah.
So this book is called Seeking the Cave, a Pilgrimage to Cold Mountain. So I had this itch for so long, I said, and after I was free from daily journalism, what's this about? Where'd this come from? And why do I have this? Why did he touch me so much? So I was able to put a trip together to China that really became a pilgrimage for me, a very personal pilgrimage.
Like a turning point in your life, really.
Well, it wasn't a turning point. The points had already turned, but rather a tremendous moment of self-understanding.
Okay.
I was doing things, but I didn't know what to call it. I really I had to go to China to realize I was a poet, even though I'd been writing poems for 40 years.
Interesting.
Because it helped me understand that. And one of the glories of China is that poets were their greatest artists. And so they really respect poets, and maybe that's part of it in their culture.
Esteem.
Yeah.
Oh. Well, this book, I haven't read it yet. I have to, Jim knows that, but I'm excited about reading it because it sounds like
it's a good story, and it takes us in two directions. The epigraphs, both of them ended up working their way to the front of the book. There's two of them. One is from Chaucer. Then do folk long to go on pilgrimage, and palmers to go seeking out strange strands, to distant shrines well known in sundry lands. And that's what the external trip is. We went to China, we went to caves, we went to visit monks on the top of mountains nobody goes to, and ended up at Cold Mountains Cave, which very few had ever been to. Now it's turned into a tourist trap, apparently. But
partly because of your writing.
I think so, actually. I hate to say this. I have mixed feelings about that. But when this book came out, and but that was the outer journey. But it turned out that there was another journey that I needed to take that I didn't know, and there's a line from the Buddhist American poet Jane Hirschfield. The only true direction to travel is inward. And that's what happened. I ended up, so that's why it became, instead of a travel book, a memoir. Because my father, my family, my whole life came into it as I began to resolve this question of how it is that I became a poet and a writer.
You know, I'm sure a lot of people listening are thinking, gosh, he really did this work. He made this really transformation kind of move. And many people probably are saying, but I couldn't do it. It's too scary. It's too whatever.
Scary.
But
I don't deserve any great credit.
Is there one thing that you can say gave you the courage to pursue this kind of search?
I'll tell you, courage, I in no way deserve the word courage. I mean, I had a good job at the Star Tribune, and I loved it, and I was good at it, frankly.
But to leave a good job.
And then first I had enough money, I got to tell you that. So I mean, which is the number one thing for most people. So I had enough money set aside, so I could
check that.
It's huge. Even then, you know, I could have maybe still have been there. Who knows? But we had a daughter, and a daughter. This was 10 years younger than the rest, which is a segue to this next book, actually. And she's 10 years younger, and she was, for her first 14 years, a complete mystery. Brilliant and, shall we say, eccentrically finding her own path. And we couldn't figure her out, and she wouldn't go to school.
Oh, wow.
And finally, I mean, she would drop in and out, and finally, after her trying about 4 or 5 different schools her freshman year of high school, and she said, just forget it. I'm a square peg in a round hole. They kind of had to wake up. And I realized that she'd been home for the whole year, the previous year, driving my wife bananas because she wouldn't get up in the morning. You couldn't get her out of bed. And then she'd be up and around and doing her thing. So I said, I got to leave because I can't. I'll take care of her for the next year because it's just too much for my wife to go into this again.
Take turns there.
Yeah, and then what happened is I resigned from the Star Tribune end of August 31st. 5 days later, she walked into school and didn't look back. And I was standing there going,
wow.
And I told this story to somebody. That allowed me to go to my mentor, Robert Bly's conference called the Great Mother Conference, which I'd never been able to go to before because I was always too busy. And I told this story to somebody there, and I'll tell it to you and to your audience. So I told somebody this story, and this woman looked up and said, well, she saved you, you know.
Wow.
And I went, so true. Because I was able to access my art life, which is really my passion. But it took a long time. I'm no hero in this transition. It was very slow and creaky, and my daughter deserves the credit for kicking me out of my job.
But there's hope in the story, too, for everybody thinking, you know, who knows what's around the corner?
Yeah.
Who knows what might shift in my life? Well, the marriage book, 50 years of poems from a marriage. This has gotten wonderful reviews.
Yes.
Some charming, charming poems. It's so personal, isn't it?
Yeah, it is. And sometimes, in fact, as you saw with the Seeking the Cave, I did 2 national tours around the country for that book. This one I've hardly done because I had a big kickoff and we had a couple hundred people there. It was a great success. And I've done readings around, but nothing like I did because it is very personal. Some of them are actually quite hard to read. There's not, any real relationship. With this book, I knew, a publisher years ago wanted to publish my love poems. And I said, no way.
Too intimate?
No, they're in there.
Oh, you did?
But rather, that's not what a relationship is. That's just romance. A relationship is vertical through time. And I wanted to, so I had, my first manuscript I put together was 25 years of these. Well, by the time it got published, it's 50 years. And because I've been writing poems about my children and my life and this kind of sometimes very difficult relationship, and this, and near tragedies that happen with my children, and how my wife hung in there, but not always easy. I mean, it's a warts and all difficult story. And these are poems that are all written in real time. So first ones began 50 years ago, right up to the last few years. And in fact, the last one is a projection called When I Am 80, taking me to, I'm just about 75 now, so it takes me 5 years from now. And it covers the full, as Zorba the Greek said, the full catastrophe of life and the full catastrophe of relationships. And it's done very well,
Yeah, it's a beautiful book.
Yeah.
And then the one that we have to close on, because we're almost out of time, Earth in Anger. Now that, even the colors look angry, don't they?
He's doing my next book too. This is Red Dragonfly Press. And I'll tell you that, so this book, I'd left the Star Tribune, and I've been still, but I never stopped covering and being active. I'm very active in a variety of organizations, 350.org, for example. This is dedicated to the founder, Bill McKibben, the founder of 350.org,
neat.
Which is the global leader in fighting climate change, organizing against the forces who won't deal with climate change. But I've been trying everything I could, and knowing the facts, and I'm realizing we're not getting there. We're not getting anywhere near where we need to. And frankly, when these poems were written, and these are the things I do early in the morning when I'm off by myself, and they just lie there, they're filled with grief about this calamitous problem facing us and my inability to deal with it. And
our inability.
Well, but this is personal. This is the personal side. Remember, I'm on the other side of the blood-brain barrier now. So these are things where I'm feeling this. And so suddenly that summer of 2011, I think, the title of a Pablo Neruda book popped into my mind, which is a very famous book of his, of love poems, 20 poems of love and a song of despair. And I thought, I wonder if I have 20 poems of love and despair for planet Earth. And I went through my stuff, and we ended up 25. Yeah.
Yes, of love and despair, and what, telling words. We are almost out of time,
Okay.
Jim. I can't believe how fast it's gone.
Well,
Way too fast.
A delight to talk to you.
I want to have you give your website, because
Okay.
I'm sure people are going to say, I want to learn more about what you're doing, follow you more, and give us the actual title.
Okay. It's coyotepoet.com. Just to step back, my first book and a column I did for years, you could show this, was The Urban Coyote. Howlings on family,
yes,
community, and the search for peace and quiet. And these are essays, and they're fun essays about community life and family.
In 1 minute, you said in some of your writings just very recently, there is an act, the Environmental Act of 2019, that is really, really important.
Well,
What happened to that? Did it, I mean,
well,
is
there's
it
a
still
lot going on. I'll tell you what, the one thing maybe
fluid?
everybody wants to know about, I think the date is September 26th, but you can check.
Oh, it's
But there's
major.
an international strike being called to bring the governments of the world to their senses, and the people in the world to their senses, organized by Bill McKibben on 350.org. Go on the website of 350.org and see. That's the next big international thing. Things are going on every day. Greta Thunberg's walking out of school every Friday. She's got millions of
Right.
kids all over the world walking out of school every Friday, telling their parents and their governments, wake up. These are just pieces of a very large international puzzle. And we're going to get Hughes shall remain nameless out of office, because he's a nightmare.
Yes.
All the bad people he brought into his administration, but the good ones are coming in. 29 states are doing great work, and Minnesota should be very proud. We're doing a lot of good work to move on our own.
So there's hope among the despair, isn't there?
Yes, and actually there's, if you have another second, I mean, Bill McKibben came up with incredible tactics, one of which just divestment from fossil fuels. $8 trillion are now divested, committed to divest and move it.
Because of that
Because of the
push?
decision he made
Wow.
to tell us to do this 6 years ago.
So out of crisis comes some opportunity
Huge
too.
movement, huge movement.
I want to have you come back sometime soon and tell us more, because I'm
I'd be happy
learning so fast and so much here, and I'm sure the viewers are. So thank you, Jim, so much for coming down.
Thank you for doing your show, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you for being with us. I'll be back again next week. Until then, have a good week, and check out his website. It's something you want.
Coyotepoet.com.
Coyotepoet.com. Got it. Okay. Bye-bye. See you next week.